Is this the OLED killer? Today we're looking at the Philips Evnia 32M2N6800M, which features a whopping 1152 local dimming zones thanks to its IPS Mini LED structure. It has got a form factor of 31.5 inch, a resolution of 4K, and a refresh rate of 144 Hz. Better still, it has got DisplayHDR 1000 certification for that lifelike HDR reproduction, and also adaptive sync technologies. All of this comes in at £740, which makes it an interesting proposition for those people who do not want an OLED gaming monitor. So in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag, and of course how it compares to some of its key competitors. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at 0 milliseconds, at least according to my testing methodology. What I can say subjectively is that the monitor did a tremendous job while playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2. Not that I would often pick a 4K 144Hz monitor for said games, but nonetheless it was good to know that this monitor did a phenomenal job. Now here I would just like to highlight that this figure and also my subjective input was done with the low input lag mode enabled. This is an option that you can select via the monitor's OSD. I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to disable it. Now the reason I'm highlighting this is because if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, it will grey it out. Now I don't have an objective number for this, however subjectively I can say it does add a slight extra bit of input lag. Not so much so that it will actually throw me off in the slightest, but just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Now equally, another important factor when it comes to testing a monitor is the overall response time. And here this monitor actually left me jaw dropped. Not only subjectively but also objectively. Now granted, it's not going to compete with any sort of OLED monitor out there because the OLED technology is pretty much class leading when it comes to giving you the best sort of visual experience and also the faster sort of response times, but in the grander scheme of things, I don't think you're going to really notice a difference. Let me explain. Using the OSRTD tool, I has the average initial time, in other words the average G to G, clocked in at 3.34 milliseconds with the overdrive set to off, which is indeed quite fascinating. With the fast mode, for some reason, this goes up to 3.61 milliseconds. But the recommended mode, which I used while testing this monitor, was the faster mode preset, with the average time sitting at 3.1 milliseconds. Now, what I absolutely love is that the percent in window sits at 100%. In other words, it is hitting that 144 Hz refresh rate window. Now, the faster mode preset is what I would recommend because you've got minimal RGB overshoot, which you'll be able to see towards the middle of your screen. Now if we transition to the fastest mode overdrive setting, you can see a lot more error. But in practice, when you're playing hardcore competitive games, the fastest mode preset might be agreeable to your eyes. If however you're playing more graphically intense games, then you might want to dial it down to its faster mode preset. Now the reason I'm saying this is because the fastest mode preset betters the average initial time to just 2.47 milliseconds, which indeed is stonkingly good specifically for a 4K IPS monitor. Now the visual experience and the clarity is not too bad either. Granted, yet again, it's not going to compete with an OLED, specifically higher refresh rate monitors out there on the market, but here you can see that the inverse ghosting is pretty minimal and only really noticeable on its fastest mode preset towards the lighter shades. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that both the visual experience and the overall response time of this monitor were actually really impressive. Now one thing I would just like to point out is that motion blur reduction technologies are not included, which is a little bit of a shame because it would have one-upped pretty much every single OLED out there on the market, specifically at its refresh rate of 144 Hz. Nonetheless, this monitor is not really aimed, at least in my opinion, to hardcore competitive gamers, because who's going to pick a 31.5 inch 4K 144 Hz monitor for playing hardcore games such as Counter-Strike 2 or Valorant? Nonetheless, it might have been a nice unique selling point by the manufacturer to include it because it would have one-upped some of its rivals. So moving on from hardcore competitive gaming, let's talk about adaptive sync technologies and also where this monitor really shines, HDR. Now first off, on the former, the monitor does not have a built-in G-Sync module, and as such has got a VR range from 48 up to 144 Hz. In my case, with an RTX 3080 and while connected over DisplayPort, I had no sort of black screen issues or flickering while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, which isn't the same that could be said about some OLED gaming monitors out there on the market. Nonetheless, it doesn't really throw me off while using an OLED gaming monitor, but it's great to see that this LCD IPS from Philips doesn't suffer from any sort of flicker. Now, what really stood out more than anything was the overall HDR performance. And yes, indeed, it has got that DisplayHDR 1000 certification, that 4K resolution, that 144Hz fluidity, and also that whopping 1152 local dimming zones. This means you're going to get a lifelike reproduction and one that will really compete with some OLEDs that give you that fantastic contrast ratio. Now, when I was using this monitor, I actually preferred using the DisplayHDR 1000 mode. This is the mode that can be selected when HDR is enabled, and you can find the different selections via the monitor's OSD. Now, this does not give you any sort of brightness controls, nor gives you the ability to enable or disable local dimming. If, however, you do want said controls, you might want to go with one of the other HDR modes, and this will indeed give you full brightness controls and also the ability to enable and disable local dimming. Now, on that note, local dimming is actually done really well. You've got very little blooming effect, even on the high local dimming option, and therefore means that if you're going to be consuming a lot of content with dark scenes on them, and you've got, let's say, a contrasting mouse cursor or something like that that goes across the screen, it's not going to throw you off. Something that I've been overly critical about with some other Mini LED IPS monitors, but it's good to see that this Philips monitor actually does a tremendous job in this department. Now, to conclude the gaming section, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. And here the monitor has got two HDMI 2.1 ports and therefore will allow you to output 4K at 120Hz or of course 60Hz or indeed at different resolutions. Now, using the faster mode preset on the overdrive setting, which is the one that I would recommend, I had the average initial time, which again translates to average G to G, at just 2.93 milliseconds, yet again hitting 100% of that refresh rate window. Now, on its fastest mode preset, this actually drops down slightly to 2.41 milliseconds, making it even more responsive. Although do bear in mind there's a lot more RGB overshoot on your screen, which is a bit more noticeable at 120Hz. Specifically over here, if we now drop it down to 60Hz, the faster mode preset gives you an average initial time of just 2.95 milliseconds, while on the fastest mode preset, you get 2.3 milliseconds. Now, for me to demonstrate the visual experience again, here you can see the results of the faster and fastest mode settings at 120Hz and 60Hz. Yet again re-emphasizing that the fastest mode preset will result in a little bit of RGB overshoot, in other words inverse ghosting, and this will be noticeable towards the lighter shades. So its overall gaming performance is seriously impressive, but it gets even better when we talk about the overall image quality. Now, as a reminder, you've got a 31.5-inch Mini LED IPS panel that runs 4K at up to 144Hz. You've also got a matte coating to it. Now, it's also worth mentioning over here that in comparison to OLED monitors, you do not have an odd sub-pixel layout, and as such, text legibility is really good, specifically given its overall resolution. Now, 3D Monitor's OSD, you have also got dedicated sRGB, Adobe RGB, and DCI-P3 color modes, which is actually quite impressive. Now, concentrating on the sRGB mode at first, you'll be able to see that the gamut coverage was tested at 91.7% and a gamut volume of 94.5%. Below, you can see how it compares to the standard. The average LTE sits at just 1.86 with a maximum of 2.72. The tested contrast ratio come in at 1183 to 1, which of course is not going to compete with an OLED which goes to infinity to 1, while its measured white point is actually relatively close to the 6504 Kelvin target at 5920 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it's relatively close yet again, but does go slightly AWOL towards the extremities. Now, moving over to the Adobe RGB mode, you can see here that the gamut coverage was clocked in at 97.2% and a gamut volume of 101.4%. You can see below how it compares to the standards. The average LTE is yet again impressive at 1.45 and a maximum of just 2.61. The tested contrast ratio does not change, while the measured white point does slightly shift at 5984 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it's very much similar to the one that was observed with the sRGB mode. So shifting over now to the DCI-P3 color space, you can see the gamut coverage was tested at 98.3% and a gamut volume of 103.1%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. Yet again, the average LTE is very impressive at 1.48 with a maximum sitting at just 2.84. Therefore showcasing that this monitor is color accurate and can be used for serious image editing work or video grading in the sRGB, Adobe RGB and the DCI-P3 color spaces, which is actually quite a rarity. Yet again over here, the tested contrast ratio does not shift. However, the measured white point does actually get a little bit better at 6009 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, in comparison to the 2.6 standard, because this is what's required for the DCI-P3 color space, it is yet again just a little bit off. Past the overall color performance, let's talk about peak luminance. And here, with the display HDR mode selected, I noticed a peak of 1510 nits. Indeed, it does get blindingly bright if you do want it to have that. In the HDR Vivid mode, this does drop to 1195 nits. Now in SDR, where I do think it's really impressive, it does get all the way to 936 nits. So you'll have no problems whatsoever running this monitor in any sort of bright room. Now it's also worth noting that local dimming is also available in SDR. And with the different modes, this will affect the overall peak brightness that one can attain. Indeed, it does get a little bit brighter with local dimming enabled. Now, the only downside of this monitor is that it's still actually very bright, even when you drop it all the way down to its 0% brightness, clocking it at 104 nits, which is brighter than some OLED monitors will get at roughly 50% brightness. Now, I'm making this aware to you just because if you're going to be using this monitor in a completely pitch black environment, you might find it a little bit too bright for your needs. Now elsewhere, I should also talk about brightness uniformity, and across the board on my tested panel, which I do appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, it did do a tremendous job, yet again showcasing the fact that this monitor can be used for some serious image editing work. Now in terms of the overall backlight bleed, it is indeed present if you have local dimming disabled. You'll be able to see these images where taken in a completely pitch black environment with local dimming completely disabled. However, with the local dimming enabled and on its highest mode preset, the monitor goes completely black. And this image was taken in the same pitch black environment, but my camera tried to compensate for it, and therefore it means that this monitor does go completely dark. Yet again over here competing with some OLED monitors, which will give you that same sort of effect. Now while that's all very impressive, there are two issues that I would just like to highlight before you go out and purchase this monitor. And first off, there's a small little faint buzzing sound that can be heard. It's actually very hard to notice, but with my sensitive ears and also with a pretty quiet noise environment, I was able to notice it. It sounds almost like an electrical circuit sort of sound. It's quite hard for me to demonstrate it and indeed record it, but I can tell you it is there because when I do switch off the monitor or indeed go to my daily driver, then it does completely disappear. Now, part that, it is also worth highlighting over here that the monitor, when tested with the OSRTT tool, which is for the response time, did notice quite a lot of brightness fluctuations, almost like the brightness was not actually constant. Now, I'm not really sure as to why this is, because the monitor is rated as flicker free, and I didn't encounter any sort of headache or problems while using this monitor, but again, it's just something I thought I should highlight, just in case you're overly sensitive towards that, then it's just something that you might want to consider, or indeed look out for or test when you do actually purchase it. So moving on from these tests, I would like to talk about its overall build quality. And here it's got a three-side boards design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. The power LED at the front of the monitor can also be fully disabled via the monitor's OSD. Now the stand itself is in part made by recycled materials, which is very much appreciated. It also provides you a sturdy feel and has got height, tilt and pivot adjustments, although it cannot be swiveled, which is slightly a shame, specifically given that my unit that I received was actually slightly off-angled. If you did notice it via the B-roll, kudos to you. Now thankfully you can replace the stand with a VESA compatible one, and here it allows you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now at the back of the monitor you've got some RGB lights. Now normally I'm not really fond of them, but in this respect you've actually got Philips' Ambi-Glow technology, which actually does work a treat. Not only are the LEDs pretty bright, but they also can follow what you can see on the screen, giving you that extra layer of immersion. Certainly appreciated if you're going to be using this monitor in a pretty dark environment. Now for you to adjust the Ambi-Glow settings, you can do so via the monitor's OSD, which is accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the back right hand side of the monitor. Now the OSD itself does provide you all the right options that you'll require, although it's a little bit convoluted and hard to understand, although once you get your head around it, it does become second nature, but I do wish that Philips had used a little bit of a different contrast. The white and purple look of it makes it a little bit hard to see at certain times as to what you're actually adjusting. Now through the OSD you might have noticed a volume setting, and this is indeed to adjust the volume output of the 3.5mm jack. Indeed, the monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers, which doesn't really bother me in the slightest, however it's slightly a shame given the overall target demographic of this Philips monitor. Now, in terms of the other connectivity options, you've got those two HDMI 2.1 ports and a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input. Then you've also got 3 USB Type A ports with a singular USB Type B port input which goes onto your PC. So with all that in mind, can I see myself recommending this Philips monitor? Well, in a nutshell, I do think it's a tremendous value proposition for those people who do not want an OLED. See, while it's £740, and I do appreciate that is actually pretty spenny, if you do consider its complete feature sets and the overall performance that it actually delivers, it is actually tremendously good. See, here you've got a low input lag, a fantastic response time, you've got minimal amount of overshoot, you've also got a lifelike HDR reproduction with that DisplayHDR 1000 certification, you've got that Mini LED structure with that 1152 local dimming zones, which can be enabled in SDR and also HDR. You've also got fantastic color accuracy in the sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 color spacers, and to top it off, you have got those HDMI 2.1 ports, which gives it that sort of flexibility and versatility with modern day consoles. As a result of all of this, I can certainly see myself recommending it, and as such it gets my Best Buy award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and if you would pick it over some rival alternatives, including OLEDs. If you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.